before we get to the discussion about election results, we'd like to thank our team of sponsors because they make it possible to hold this discussion and deliver high-quality journalism to you every single day. So I'd like to thank the folks at Cross Insurance, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Katahdin Trust, Memic, Veryl Dana, and Whipflea MacPage. And we are also deeply thankful to Kevin and Coffee by Design for providing us with the caffeine this morning. Their coffee's always delicious and they're huge supporters, so thank you to Coffee by Design. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Carol Coultas. Carol.
Everyone hear me back there? Both Kim and I are recovering from colds, and so please bear with us while we sip our coffee and suck on lozenges and do whatever we need to keep our throats clear enough to participate in this panel discussion. When we were talking about a good topic for our November breakfast forum, we said, hey, it's going to be 3 weeks after the election, so maybe there's something we can do looking at the outcome and the impact on the business community and Maine's economy. Because this was back in late September when we were talking about this, and you couldn't turn on a TV or a radio or flip a page in the Press Herald without seeing all kinds of political advertising and a lot of stories. And so much of it was us versus them. It was a horse race. Who's going to have the upper hand when it is all said and done? But there wasn't a lot of analysis with respect to what is the impact going to be in Maine's business community, in particular, given that so much of Maine's business community is driven by small businesses, companies with fewer than 20 employees. So we thought that would be a great thing to talk about. I queried our political staff at the paper, and I said, hey, who are really good, thoughtful political types, people who've served in the legislature, maybe are lobbyists now or economists now, but who can really speak to what's likely to happen now that the dust has settled, or nearly settled, so, since the 2nd District still seems to be a little bit in a state of flux. And without hesitation, our political reporters and political editor mentioned the people who are sitting to my left. So I approached them and they said, sure, we're happy to talk about what we think might happen and to provide some analysis. And so that's how we got here this morning. So typically our breakfast forums are interactive. I encourage the panelists to comment on each other's observations. We will have a Q&A at the end, but if you have a burning question that's relevant to the topic that they're discussing right now, raise your hand and we'll take your question as it occurs. And without any further ado, I'm going to introduce folks and then get right to it. So, to my immediate left is Josh Tardy. He is an attorney with Rudman Winchell. He works primarily in civil and criminal litigation, but also real estate and counseling business clients. Josh also is he continues to do his legislative affairs work with the company he founded, Mitchell, Tardy, and Jackson. And he's one of our folks here who has real experience in the legislature. He served District 25 as a representative between 2002 and 2010, where he served as House Minority Leader twice. So welcome, Josh. I think you bring terrific experience here. And right next to Josh is Kim Cook. So Kim founded her own company called Government Strategies in 2006. Her practice focuses on a wide range of strategic public affairs services to clients, including government relations, legislative and administrative advocacy, policy monitoring, and strategic communications. She has not served in the legislature, but she does serve on Portland City Council, and she represents District 5, which is Deering Center, Riverton, and North Deering. And then rounding out our panel is Mike Saxl. He became managing principal of Maine Street Solutions and also is of counsel to Veryl Dana. So he, like Josh, has a lobbying aspect in his professional life, but he also is an attorney with a law firm here. And among his achievements was a lot of successful work in expanding dental access to people here in Maine while he was in the legislature. And what's interesting is all three of our panelists are graduates of Maine Law, so yay for Maine Law. Okay, so here we go. Governor-elect Janet Mills has very different priorities from her immediate predecessor on issues as wide-ranging as healthcare, broadband, and energy, especially renewable energy. So my first question to our panels is, where do you think there will be consensus with the 129th legislature, which now has a Democrat in the Blaine House and Democrat control in both the Senate and the House of Representatives? So I'm sort of trying to find out, what are your expectations? Like 6 months' time or so, what do you think might happen in terms of where her priorities and the makeup of this new legislature, where they intersect? So I'm going to give that to Josh first.
Okay.
We'll just go right down the line.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. So as I came into the legislature as the King administration was leaving, so I saw the transition firsthand from Governor King to Governor Baldacci, and I'm right there at ground zero watching the transition from Governor LePage to Governor-elect Mills. And in both instances, it is remarkable to watch the orderly transition of power. Certainly the Baldacci administration had cooperation from Governor King, and I'm pleased to report that the Mills transition team is finding high cooperation from Governor LePage's staff. So to respond, so what are we expecting to see? A lot of that is, where is there going to be consensus? We have a great history in the legislature of having 2/3 supermajority budgets. We saw that regardless of who was in the majority, and I've seen every possible model. I've seen gridlock with the Senate controlled by one party and the House controlled by the other. I served when I had significant minorities when I was Republican leader, and we were always able to get consensus around what that spending package should be. And I think the most important bill in every legislative session is that budget bill, because it defines what government will provide for the citizens of Maine. And I really think that despite the fact that you see partisan wars and tough political rhetoric, bare-knuckle brawls politically, I think that there's a good tradition in the legislature is setting that aside and getting to consensus budget processes. I mean, there are definite friction points, and we will see that. But I think that we will see a leader in Governor-elect Mills that will want to have a supermajority budget, and I think that's where I am most confident that we'll see consensus. And that's just my initial comment.
Okay, Kim?
Thanks. And also thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here this morning, and hopefully you all can hear me and my voice lasts for the next hour. I agree with what Josh said, that we will have a budget. I think that despite the majorities, I don't think they'll go for a majority budget, which I think we've all seen once, maybe in the last 20 years or so, where the legislature did a simple majority budget. But I think we will continue to have that. And it really does, I think, a great service to the state for us to do that. In other areas that I think we will see consensus on, these probably won't be a surprise to many of you, Medicaid expansion, which there has been consensus on in the legislature, but not quite the 2/3 necessary to override the veto. So I think the governor-elect has said that she is chomping at the bit to move forward on expansion, and that will be a big deal for rural hospitals in particular, but really for quite a number, 70,000 or so people who are struggling to afford any sort of health care coverage. I think other areas are certainly on the renewables side, with solar and wind in particular, seeing a boost and consensus among the majorities in the House and the Senate, as well as the governor-elect. I think we will see a good amount of focus on public health and substance use disorder treatment and addressing the opioid crisis. There has been a difference, although I think there's been consensus that there's a real problem. Often what I think we see when there are honest differences among the parties and among people, even on the same party, it's just deciding on what the solution ought to be and coming to consensus on the right solution, even when everybody agrees what the problem is. And I think we will see some action both on the opioid crisis and increased access to treatment, but also, this is a little bit further down in the weeds, the public health system throughout the state has really taken quite a hit over the last 8 years, and I think there's some consensus around rebuilding that system.
Kim, what do you mean? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
On the public health system, just I think increased staffing, both at the state and regional levels around public health, whether that's moving on vaccination rates, which I know there's some members of the legislature who are going to make that their top priority, maternal health. Maine has really fallen behind our region in mortality rates, and that's not a good place to be for those of us in particular who have babies. So I think we've got a lot of work, and it really goes beyond those things. But a couple other areas that I think we'll see less impact on small business, but I think you'll see some focus on juvenile and restorative justice issues, student loan debt issues, and that has been something, again, there's been broad, even with the LePage administration, there's been a focus for him. I think everybody recognizes the intersection between student loan debt and the burden that poses and our workforce challenges, and we can somehow tie those together to try to address workforce by addressing student loan debt and incentivizing people to come here or to stay here after they finish their community college, their regular college, their graduate programs. And on the municipal side, which I'm excited about, both I think from being a citizen of the state, but also on the city council, I do think we will see a renewed focus around property tax relief, and in particular around increasing revenue sharing back to municipalities, back to what the statutes require, 5% this coming fiscal year, and school funding.
Wow. Excuse me. Great. That's quite a list. How about you, Mike?
Where Kim is recovering from a cold and is having troubles with her voice, I have the opposite problem. I'm a recovering politician and having problems not stopping my voice. I think thank you all for inviting us here today, Carol and the Press Herald. It's a terrific honor to be here. So I think there's an extraordinary opportunity for building consensus amongst leaders, amongst legislators, and amongst the new administration. I can be super specific. I think the most easy one where we're going to see immediate progress is in workforce development and building on many of the recent successes of the LePage administration, where there was beginning to become an alignment between the community college system and the career centers, hopefully the workforce investment boards, and the business community sitting at the same table to make efficient, directed investments in developing our workforce that result in qualified workforce. I'm with you.
There's a fan.
Qualified workforce, economic growth, and success and prosperity for the state of Maine. I don't think that's a partisan issue. I think that aligning those resources is way overdue. I think there was an effort from the LePage administration to begin that process. I think the Mills administration, working with the community college system, President Langhauser, the University of Maine, Chancellor Page, and the private, proprietary, and union apprenticeship programs, will do a lot to help and serve Maine business community and therefore Maine workers. I think that's number one. Number two, I think Kim is spot on Maine Care expansion. I think that while not having as broad a base of consensus, is generally well looked upon pretty much regardless of party, unless you're from the further ends of the conservative movement, which I think there's strong concerns about it from that part of the party. But from moderate Republicans, of which there remain a few, and all the Democrats, I think there's a consensus on healthcare. I think that will be really important for a lot of other reasons for Maine and our prosperity. I think that having an insurance product that covers uninsured individuals will lessen the pressure on Maine hospitals who are paying bad debt and charity care. It will allow insurers to negotiate better for rates on premiums, and it will serve Maine businesses by having a healthier, more active workforce. So I think that's a no-brainer, and I think that's going to happen almost immediately. I would expect, along with Kim, other kinds of public health initiatives which begin to look at some of those deficits that have been accrued over the last 8 years. There was broad-based consensus, for example, on creating an adult dental benefit within Maine Care so that adults in Maine have access to dental care. I think that's going to happen in the next administration, and I think that's very exciting. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is, while there could be a tax reform, although I'm skeptical after working on it for 25 years, I don't think there's going to be any broad-based tax increases. I think that there's relative large consensus that there may be a reshuffling of priorities, but I don't think there's a big hunger to increase the income tax, for example. I think there'll be an effort to look at tax exemptions. I think there'll be an effort to look at tax exclusions, worth up to about $2.2 billion of the budget to prove that they have a purpose moving forward, that they're meeting a need. But I don't expect to see a broad-based tax increase. I would see incremental tax policy. I think it will largely mirror whatever is happening at the federal level, and I think you'll see a consistent economic environment that Maine businesses should be excited to participate in.
So that begs the question, since two of you have mentioned the Medicaid expansion, I know that the governor has just, requested a stay on the court order that to implement the Medicaid expansion immediately. But I'm still a little fuzzy on how that expansion would be paid for. So can you address that under the Janet Mills administration? How do you think that's going to shake out?
I think there's lots of ways they can do it, but I think the easiest two ways are looking at the FMAP account, which is the federal Medicaid account, which has a surplus in it right now, and which they could draw down and apply to the expansion at the state's 10% obligation. And there's obviously the economy is growing, and there's money in the general fund to pay for it. I don't think you need to increase taxes to broaden access to health care.
I don't disagree. I think that FMAP account and the general fund surplus will be able to get the ball rolling. I'm not sure we could say it's a consensus issue. It's like if an officer tells you you're under arrest and put your hands behind your back and you do it, you cooperate, and then they say that's not necessarily consensus. I think from a political... But
it moves forward.
It's going to move forward. And politically speaking, many Republicans, that was a shoot your way out of the saloon issue, and it's now you're out of the saloon, and it didn't go so good. And I think from a political standpoint, the sooner that it's in the rearview mirror, the better it's going to be for Republicans tactically.
I would agree. I think I think the latest estimate we had seen was about $54.5 million annually for the state share, and the proposal that didn't make it through the legislative process last time took money out of the general fund, essentially what would otherwise go into the rainy day fund, as well as the Fund for Healthy Maine. I'm not sure they'll want to tap that necessarily, but even in the first quarter of this fiscal year, I just checked last night, the latest figure I found was that we were running $47.5 million above what the revenue projections were for this fiscal year, which started July 1. And so you can see that even in this coming fiscal year, I mean, assuming no tank in our economy in the next bid, we're running over what we budgeted to spend. The money seems to be there without, now, I think the debate has been over whether that's a sustainable source of funding, right? Because you don't always run, well, wouldn't it be great if we always ran a budget surplus, but we don't. And we need that rainy day fund there and to continue to put money into it. But it does seem that there is a relatively easy way, at least in this fiscal year, to fund that expansion.
You know, I might just jump in and say that one other piece that makes consensus a lot more doable in the next legislature is the nature of the people that were elected, both to leadership and to the legislatures. For example, the Maine House Democratic Caucus, for the first time that I think in history, is 55% women. And I think that's a really good structural change within the caucus and thinking about the different ways different people process information and build consensus. I think that the 4 caucuses elected excellent leaders who will kind of harken back to the days when Josh and I served and we had really collaborative, I mean, we didn't always agree, but we had really collaborative working relationship. We didn't surprise each other. We had candid conversations. We looked to have find common ground. Dana Dow, the new Republican leader in the Senate, is just a common sense, good guy who's run a Maine small business and is open for conversations, have worked very well with him. Kathy Dillingham is a new House Republican leader, similarly situated, really thoughtful, very bright, incisive thinking. And Speaker Gideon and President Jackson also have demonstrated themselves as wanting to reach out, wanting to find ways to work in common ground. I would expect that an old tradition that was in the King administration when I served, I spent 6 years having breakfast once a week with the governor, with all the other leaders, and Senator Davis, who is nobody's moderate. He's a very conservative guy. He and I became fast friends because for 6 years we had breakfast together, and I knew about his wife, and I knew about his family, and he knew about mine, and to this day we get along really well. We don't surprise each other. We don't agree, but we have a good collegial working relationship. I expect Governor Mills to restart those kinds of conversations, and I think the leaders, regardless of the governor's actions, will take it upon themselves to have that kind of candid, cordial working relationship. I think there'll be a lot less posturing. There's not a gubernatorial election on the cusp. I can understand why some people might have postured in the last legislature for other political interests, but I don't see any of those leaders having those specific interests, and I think it's going to result in a really good conversation. And I think mostly, in my experience, that people who run, regardless of where they are on that partisan continuum, people who run for the legislature are good people, and they are running for a reason, and they want to help Mainers do better. And I think all of them want that individuals in Maine to have better economic futures and for the state to be economically strong. And so I think there's a lot of room for consensus.
So as a journalist, Mike, I can't tell you, well, as a resident of Maine, I am so delighted to hear that you see a collaborative tenor in Augusta going forward. As a journalist, I think, oh, so many fewer page one stories. I'm okay with that. So just one little aside, Kim, when you mentioned the surplus that the state revenues are showing right now, I know that about 25 or 26 million of that is because of a one-time infusion of corporate taxes that are related to the tax conformity law. So that's only going to be one time. So I think your point about the sustainability of financing things like Medicaid expansion, I think that's really important. We keep getting press releases from the state saying, "Hey, we're in fabulous financial shape," but if you drill down a little bit, it's like we're okay, but we're not in the sort of shape where we've got tons of surplus money that either needs to stay in the rainy day fund or be allocated for certain purposes. So I know when in my conversations with business people post-election, they have two really big concerns about a Democrat-controlled state government. One is for many folks, they associate a Democrat-controlled government with increased spending and then increased taxes. And the other thing that they're concerned about is enhanced regulatory oversight. Those are the two things I hear a lot from the business community. So I wonder if you guys could address that. Whoever wants to go first.
Can I take a crack at it?
Sure. So I think, at least on increased taxes, Governor-elect Mills has come out and stated at this point that she does not plan tax increases, broad-based tax increases in her first budget. I think it's been her statement. So, and for those of you who know Janet Mills, and I've worked with her, you all have, I'm sure, worked with her longer even than I have, but as a member of the Appropriations Committee, as the Attorney General, and I'm sure as the Governor, she's a pretty straight shooter. She doesn't just tell you what you want to hear; she just tells it like it is, in my experience, and whether you want to hear it or not. And so, and I appreciate that actually. And so I believe that her budget won't propose a broad-based tax increase. I have heard some interest in rebalancing how we collect taxes. I agree with Mike that it's hard to be optimistic that we will go back to the efforts at tax reform where we lowered income taxes and broaden out our sales tax to be more in line with how other states collect revenue and to be more stable in a recession. Because the last attempt, although it had some bipartisan support, was undone at the ballot box. So I think it's difficult, but I wouldn't be surprised to see an attempt at it. I wouldn't call it, I bet it will be revenue neutral, but I guess we will have to see how the economy goes. In terms of the regulatory environment, I think there's some pent-up demand among the Democrats, and I'm sure with coming Democrats, to see some changes in human resource types of an employee benefit kinds of policies. That's one area where I expect at least a number of bills anyway, and I wouldn't be surprised that they get through, but things like family paid maternity leave or paternity leave and paid family leave, paid sick time, those kinds of things. I wouldn't be surprised to see some others as well, but those in particular come to my mind at first.
I agree. I think Family Medical Leave Act, paid sick leave, there'll be attempts to take another shot at increasing the minimum wage. I mean, I'm not sure that will be successful, but there will be that friction. And I think what I'm really, looking at with wonder is watching there's always a friction. One party has all the reins here, control of both houses and control of the second floor. Who's going to emerge as the power broker? And I know that labels are fraught with peril, but you have a Senate president in Troy Jackson who's more conservative. You have a more progressive House, and I would go right out there and say that Janet Mills, as a legislator, was conservative fiscally, and so how is she going to be able to control her agenda and keep the legislators that are there behind her happy? So that type of friction and how she resolves that is going to be a function of who she brings onto the second floor, who she has as commissioners, what's her cabinet going to look like. And there are going to be times when Governor Mills will look to the Republican caucus to try to prevent and use as a negotiation tool. And so I'm looking forward to that whole.
I'm before I get back to the question, I'm going to riff a little bit on about what Josh was saying. So I think the person with the hardest job in this next legislature is Matt Moonen, who represents this district. It's my old district as well, many years ago. I think with 93 Democrats, which is, what is it?
89.
89 Democrats and 4 independents working together. that the way to managing that pent-up expectation that they live in a world of infinite possibilities with the diversity and the continuum of ideology that goes from Bernie Sanders and socialist democratic interests to my old friend Marty Groman, moderate Democrats who want to grow the economy and then build the social infrastructure that's sustainable. And I'm with you on that, Marty. I think that Matt is going to have an extremely tough challenge, and he's going to need to have a really good caucus consensus building process where everybody gets to throw their ideas out, but they see that those ideas need to be balanced against a budget reality, because otherwise you're going to have a little bit of chaos in that House Democratic caucus. I think that's the biggest challenge for the next legislature. I think that is manageable. There are really been fabulous majority leaders who've managed large majorities, Hannah Pingree being one of them that comes to mind. And I think it's really possible to align people's expectations with the budget realities, but people need to be heard within that caucus, and they were elected to do really neat, innovative, great things. And so it won't be a surprise to me if you see somebody bring in another single-payer health care bill.
Oh, it's in.
But it will be a surprise to me if it ends up in any budget document. And the question is, what happens within that House caucus when they are disappointed about that?
And to riff on your riff, good thing the incoming House Majority Leader, I hear, has a good relationship with the incoming Chief of Staff
Yes.
For the governor. And so there'll be, I think there may be some off-the-record conversations of what actually needs to happen. So.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And you have a question, sir?
Well, my name is Jamie Willie. I live here in Portland. And we were starting to get into the weeds a little bit into tax policy. So a Portland issue, but it's actually a service center issue, is a chance for local municipalities to opt into some type of a lodging tax to help. And living here in Portland, unfortunately, I know too much about the burdens of having to reset 100-year-old infrastructure. And I'll suggest a meals tax, year-round. Local residents help support the restaurants, so I'm more hesitant about something like that. But is there any chance for to be able to opt into a lodging tax to help local municipalities with their infrastructure needs?
I've certainly been, when I was in the legislature, I dealt with the issue. I sat on taxation committee for one term, and it's an issue that hits the service center issues, communities. It's a priority, but it's yes, there's a chance. I mean, the votes might be there, but it's a very, very dangerous game that the majority party will play because it doesn't play well in the rest, in the non-service centers. And so it's, it's one where tactically Republicans will be watching, and it's Brer Rabbit. Don't throw me into the briar patch because, go ahead and raise a tax, and just because you can. And there's an election 2 years from now.
And yes, you have a question?
Yes, your initial comment, you mentioned that Mills on her campaign platform included broadband. Out of courtesy, in the back, if you use a mic.
I was just curious about comments from you about Mills' campaign platform included improving broadband service and renewable energies, and I'm wondering what your comments are about that.
Yes. Oh, no, that was not. I think you'll see a much different regulatory environment, getting back to regulations. Right. You'll see a hugely different regulatory environment involving placement and development of renewable resources. I think you will see tons of wind development, tons of solar development, possibly offshore wind development, possibly other kinds of hydros, ocean-based hydro. I think that will happen immediately. I think that it will be great for Maine's workforce. I think it will be great for moving Maine towards carbon neutral position, and I think it's going to happen. And there are a lot of really great jobs that go with it. I mean, Reed and Chimbro and all these wonderful Maine businesses that work with working class folks are going to have a really good 8 years. Hopefully 8 years, with renewable wind. What was your second half?
Well, actually, before you get to broadband, so Mike, how do you think that's going to happen? Will they just bring back the 2 solar bills that passed with the majority of both houses that were then vetoed by Governor LePage? Like, what are the mechanics of that?
I'm not clear that it will be those exact same bills, but I would expect similar legislation to come back. But I don't even think they need any legislation to pass in order to change the way regulators are addressing applications for renewables. I think you saw renewables that had 100% buy-in from the Board of Environmental Protection, which were shut down in the last 8 years because there was a fundamental disagreement about how renewables impact prices and impact businesses and impact the grid in Maine. And I think that the broader consensus is that having renewable development in Maine is good for Maine's economy and it's good for the environment. And I think you're gonna see even without a bill passing a real change.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I agree with that, and really I think we'll see changes again in net metering to sort of reverse some of the changes that have been made that make it make it easier for rooftop solar, for instance, but also community solar and the ability to buy into community solar. So I think, all of those kinds of policies, I've heard talk about bringing back an omnibus bill that,
I hope not.
I'm just saying. I wouldn't be surprised. I'd also probably expect to see it in bits and pieces in separate bills, and we'll see a lot of redundancy. I think we'll see a number of efforts on different policy fronts in that way, where you have an omnibus bill, and then you'll have bills on specific topics, and it'll be a matter of if the omnibus bill can't get through, it's just too heavy under its own weight. You can continue to move bits and pieces through, or if it's omnibus gets stuck on the appropriations table with a $1 billion fiscal note or something. So I think certainly with solar and wind in particular, but we will see some big changes right away.
Yeah, I agree. As a natural gas lobbyist and a utility lobbyist, I had a good 8 years. I think I've got my work cut out for me now. So.
And what about broadband? I know that Janet Mills made that a real priority in her platform, and she sees it as an economic development tool. I think most people in Maine's business community see the same thing. I believe her plan is to create like a utility district for broadband and try to direct investment to increasing the speed on the existing infrastructure and extending the existing infrastructure into areas where there isn't any decent broadband. Do you think that will be a priority in her administration? Is there a sense of the panel here?
No, I think so. I think it's going to be a major priority, and I think she'll be able to build some bipartisan coalitions around it.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the legislative map of who doesn't have broadband service,
Right.
they're overwhelmingly Republican rural districts.
Right.
I mean, there may not be fast enough service in suburban and urban Maine, and certainly even on the 95 corridor, for those of us who drive that all the time.
Drop calls.
Getting drop calls. But I think that there's an understanding that there could be a partnership moving forward. I would be very surprised if you saw municipal broadband projects that try to, I would suggest that the future forward is more about a partnership with the players in the marketplace or new players in the marketplace to find ways to improve services, sort of a last mile kind of concept where you're partnering with, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, whoever it might be, to bring that service to folks. I also think that there should be an eye towards flexibility based on technology. The old landline system, which is super important, will not be the only answer anymore. Now we have ways to use small cell. Now we have ways to use technology to run better community cellular services. Now we have so I think that there'll be technology will disrupt a little bit of what was traditional, and maybe we'll find efficiencies and incentivize investment from the private sector to meet that unmet need.
I would just add, I think this is one of those areas where there has been broad consensus on the problem and the need to address the problem. And then the solution evades consensus. And I think the rub essentially is that broadband is now kind of essential infrastructure for our economy, kind of like the highway system was and is back in its day. And it's a matter of figuring out the funding mechanism and how much money the government puts forward in public money to help to expand it, and how much of it should be done at the state level, how much of it should be done at the municipal level, how much of it should be left to the private sector and individual payers. And that is the piece that really needs that consensus. And when I say consensus, I guess we're looking in the House at about effectively a 25-seat majority with the Dems when you look at the left-leaning independents. And obviously we've got a 21-14 in the Senate. So consensus when you vote on things versus coming around and seeing where everybody can get to looks like these majorities. And I think they will find a way to, whether it's a bond package, I think it'll be a multifaceted solution on funding, both, and it will be about the partnerships. I wouldn't be surprised to see some bond money put towards it.
1 second. Do you think there's any political will to make broadband a regulated utility, just like telephone services?
There'll certainly be people who try. I don't think there'll be a broad-based consensus
No.
on that. I would be surprised.
Because the incentives that you need to get the carriers to do that last mile are going to be pretty hefty. They have essentially said that there's no profit in it for them to extend broadband coverage into a lot of those rural areas.
That's why, entering into it as a partnership
Right.
with industry players, small and large. There's lots of really smaller GWI, lots of smaller Maine-based players in the marketplace that have been effectively doing that kind of partnership already. Mm-hmm. And I think approaching it as a partnership rather than as a regulatory you must is going to be much more effective, especially when you think about how quickly technology. It would be great if we were building a road and that's all we had to do, but think about the evolution of the technology in the last 10 years, going from 1G to 3G to LTE to 5G and the rate of reinvestment that you have to do in order to meet the expectation of the consumer and keep up with demand. That would be an extraordinarily large number if the state took on that responsibility on their own. So thinking about creative ways to partner with industry players and incentivize the behavior you want them to adopt, good old Hamiltonian politics, make it in their best interest, right? That's the way to go, in my opinion, anyway.
Okay.
And I think that's where the legislature will land.
We have a question.
My name is Ted Carter. I own Ted Carter Inspired Landscapes. I just want to put a plug in for people in the trades industries. We are running for our lives right now. I have a great little company, but the young people coming up today are really not being trained to work with their hands and to work in the trades businesses. There's really a problem because with a lot of the renovation work that I find myself on, with home construction and new construction, HVAC people, jobs come to a halt. There's not enough people to do the work. I had a client the other day. We do a lot of gas systems. We install things, and they couldn't even find somebody in the agency that they buy the gas from to move the tank for them. They couldn't even give them a date when they could come out and move the tank. They're so busy. So we have a huge problem with employment shortage in the trades. And I think the state needs to really look at that. The educational system, as far as I'm concerned, has really done a huge disadvantage to all of us, because 10 years from now, no one's going to be here to fix our washing machines or dryers. No one's going to be here to fix anything. So I don't want to go off into a diatribe, but
The message has been received in Augusta. I think Mike mentioned it at the beginning.
The alignment.
There's an alignment. The curve is better, and the workforce development and connection with the community colleges and those programs, I think we'll see Governor Mills sort of move and extend the LePage vision on that.
Okay, great. Thank
I
you.
was king for a day. I would take every single dollar of workforce training from the Department of Labor and have the Department of Labor be a wage and hours regulatory agency. I would give all of that money to the Maine Community College system.
Oh.
And I would lower entirely the barriers. Right now, large businesses in the state of Maine, Bath Iron Works, the Bills are good at doing training because they're big enough to have a census of people, a concentration of people. But small businesses like yours get left behind, and over 50% of the employment in Maine is in small businesses like yours. And so we need to put that money into the community college system where they can work more effectively with a small business and meet your needs to get people trained to meet the jobs of tomorrow, that you are providing, those good jobs that are where people are working with their hands. So if I was king for a day, that's what I would do.
Right, and my age group, I'm a baby boomer. We're all a lot. Well, I'm not certainly, but a lot of my colleagues are retiring, and I'm doing an ESOP right now. But it's just really interesting to see how they're not being. These companies are going out of business, and no one's filling their shoes.
Yeah.
Tree companies, two tree companies went out of business just in the Kennebunks this year because they just retired.
Right, it wasn't a lack of work.
We have no problem with work, believe me.
So
Work is not a problem.
there are two things that might interest you. I don't know if you looked at Governor-elect Mills, her campaign website, but she's proposing creating a Maine Grow Authority, which consolidates all of the workforce development and job training programs under one umbrella, and to do more enhanced coordination with the community college system, specifically to address what you're talking about. And she's also proposing incentives and resources for companies that are trying to become ESOPs. So
Right.
I think because of her rural background, she understands trades probably better than maybe other people would, and is a proponent of that. And what you're talking about is not limited to your field at all. We've got more people retiring than entering the workforce, more people are dying than being born. And so workforce development, that has superseded energy and healthcare costs as the thing that keeps business owners up late at night. They don't know how to resolve workforce development. And in fact, that was one of my questions, is there anything that you think of as particularly innovative or bold that you anticipate from this administration around workforce development?
I would just add on the workforce piece, which goes to your question, Carol, that I think we cannot overlook having career and technical education at the high school level as well. So community college system is doing a wonderful job, and they are both educating and training people from welders to nurses to you name it. And that's great. But not everybody even wants to go to community college. And I think where we've done ourselves a disservice is this message that has been pervasive really for decades now, that if you're going to make it in our society, you need to have a college degree. And we all know that about 25% of the population has a bachelor's degree across the country. We also all know that, and I'm sort of happy and sad about this, in Portland we have now got our graduation rate, our high school graduation rate, up into the high 80%, which you can say, well, that's an improvement. Let's face it, that's 1 in 10, or more than 1 in 10, of our kids will not make it through high school. So community college is not an option at that point, at least not right away, until they, hopefully can move on with a GED and beyond. In order to engage that 10% of our population, we need to engage them at the high school level and show them that there's another way other than reading literature and writing essays. And I came from a working class background. My father was a truck driver, and nobody else in my family had even gone to community college. And we need to, I think, reinvest at that level as well, and take the stigma away and make it something that people want to pursue.
Very much
Working
agree.
with their hands is a noble profession, and you can learn those skills in high school.
I think of that every time I pay my mechanic's bill. He makes $80 an hour. Like, why didn't I think of that?
Yes. And it's getting kids, and it's Sean Moody, I have to say, if any of you saw him speak, and I tend to be a moderate Democrat, so you know where I was, but Sean Moody focused on this, and honestly, I would love to see the incoming administration work with Sean and other folks who had really strong ideas about reinstituting a work ethic at a young age, and I personally believe in that. Our 12-year-old is out there with a shoveling job and before school, and he's got to leave for school at 7:30, and he has to get up early, and he has to go shovel the neighbor's driveway before he goes to school on those days. And does he like it? No, he does not. Has he been doing it since he's 11, and will he keep doing it? Yes, he will, and it's in part about learning the value of work, learning the value of hard work, and it's not beneath any one of us. So anyway.
I see a lovely role for the Portland Press-Herald in bringing up the dignity and celebration of areas of work and human investment that just hasn't been happening. We celebrated the brain and the cognitive, and it's expanded and gone. If you ask me, it's practically cancerous. But the other aspects of intelligence, which science has been elevating and discovering, and their impact on what human can produce of value. It's happening. The emotional intelligences, the interpersonal intelligences are being honored, in fact, as we discover them. But I think a better job could be done for some of these young people in terms of celebrating. And they will experience it. If you cramp them into this, they're massively uncomfortable and disturbed. If you let them get out hammers and building, which, computer scientists would be at a loss for, they're in their element. So I think we need to revalue a few things, and that's where I see that the paper can give examples of that, and other media.
There's a wonderful program in Maine called Jobs for Maine Graduates. It began during the McKernan administration and was strongly supported throughout the last 24 years. And I think that experiential learning around the trades is one of the areas where the state of Maine could invest and should invest, and strengthening those aspirations and those actual people learn different ways, as you say. So I think that's a model program, not just for Maine, but for the country. And again, not a partisan issue. It's a consensus policy, and I think maybe growing programs like that might make a lot of sense.
Well, this is Bill Higgins. For those that don't know me in the audience, a Naval Academy graduate, but also an advocate for the homeless and lower income. Along with the access to broadband and information, we're going to need to expand the equipment access for the people with lower income so they can utilize that access and grow their opportunities. Now, there could be some possibility to reach out to companies that bring out this new phone. They have people trade phones in. Let's get some of the phones that are traded in and some of the equipment that's traded in for these companies. Try to get that as an access for the people that are lower income. That could be an opportunity for the state. Thank you.
So one of the other questions I had, and I think, Kim, you touched on it, in terms of a focus on HR benefits coming with this new legislature and the new governor. We were talking with the people who are getting a petition signed in order to put a ballot question together that would mandate paid sick leave. And the proponents of that have said that they were waiting to see how the elections went, because depending on that outcome, they may not seek a ballot question. They may simply seek a legislative route for those kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you think, do you think that perception is widespread, that people are going to expect this incoming government to look at and perhaps push for things like paid sick leave and more aggressive minimum wage increases and things like that? So that's also been one of the concerns I hear from the business community.
I think we're going to see several bills that do both of those. I think we're going to see wage bills. I think we're going to see paid sick leave, expanded family medical bills, and that's going to be the challenge to the second floor to Governor Mills. those are tough issues. People feel passionate about it, and on both sides, as far as what role government should play with mandating this type of activity, this type of benefit. And it's a political issue and a policy issue that's fraught with peril for both sides, really. It's a dangerous issue.
Mike or Kim, do you want to weigh in on that one?
I think Josh has got it. I mean, I think it's going to come up. I think the family medical leave bill probably does have traction. I think the idea of more minimum wage increases above what passed at the ballot box is probably unlikely to happen, but they are very strong Democratic majorities, and, expectations are high. So it is, I think he's captured it pretty well.
We have another question.
My name is Brian Walker. I'm hearing a lot of wonderful things, and almost all of them cost money. So I'm wondering, I heard paying, for example, for the Medicaid expansion out of surplus. I heard bonding mentioned. Do you guys want to just discuss a little bit about how all of this would probably be paid for if it's not with tax increases?
That was my next question. Thank you.
Well, it's not sustainable if it's not built on economic growth in the state, and so you cannot expand programs and services without either making subsequent cuts or growing the economy. I think the best way to sustainably support Maine Care expansion is by growing the economy. My expectation is they will dedicate part of the growth of the economy to meeting that demand. If they don't, it will not be sustainable.
As far as bonding goes, with Governor LePage, he had a very fiscal conservative approach to bonding, and so there is capacity. I think that there can be room. It's all about what the legislature and the second floor of the governor decide is the right amount for bonding and what fits in that package. And it becomes a battle of priorities, and it becomes some horse trading.
We're still under the state sort of threshold for bonding for our debt to revenue ratio, right? We have room for more bonding?
Yeah, one would argue that there's capacity.
Follow-up would be, you mentioned cuts. Are there places that you see possibly there being cuts in the current budget that would allow for some capacity?
That's a big rabbit hole. Specific areas.
Yes.
Matters less what we think and more. But, yeah.
I think that there's probably going to be some effort to, I know that Mike Allen, who is a career guy at the Bureau of Revenue Services, has been looking for a long time at ways to simplify the tax code, streamline the tax code, and align some incentives. And there is an ongoing process that we passed at the legislature 4 years ago where they review on a rotating basis over, I think it's a 5 or 7 year period, all tax expenditures. And I believe that they will identify areas where there are appropriate cuts. Do I know what all of them are? No, I don't. But I know that, for example, there are like 4 different tax incentive programs about home health care services. They don't get utilized very well, but they do get booked against the budget. Do I think there's a way to simplify that and align it while still creating incentives for home health care services? I think they probably is. So I think there'll be a lot of effort in that part for cuts.
I'd also just mention on the bonding side that it's not just the legislature and the governor that needs to go along. It needs a 2/3 majority, so a super majority, and then it goes to the voters. And so the voters ultimately decide how much to bond. Now, yes, I think we will go back to the days where sort of a package is put to, I anticipate sort of a return to how things used to work to some extent of putting a package together, the leadership and the governor's office decide what the number is, and then it gets negotiated, and we can all anticipate that themes that have gone across administrations will continue. Most of it will be for transportation because we, especially with higher efficiency vehicles, electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, we continue to taken far less in gas taxes than we need to deal with our transportation infrastructure. So we have to continually increase the amount we bond for. Plus, I don't think anybody in the state argues that we're doing too much to take care of our roads, our bridges, and multimodal, et cetera. Transportation, wastewater is always there, right? But then I think we'll see, in one of the things we haven't talked about yet, sort of side note, that will move forward, I think, quickly, is this bond for senior housing that the voters passed 3 years ago.
She said it would be the first thing she does.
Yes, and so it's really just been waiting on a governor's signature to be able, because the voters approved it, it's just waiting to go to the market. So we'll see some of those things that have been passed move forward. And then I think we'll see a lot of the same kinds of things for bonds, except what might be different would be potentially broadband, potentially, I think it was the Governor LePage's idea to bond for student loan debt. I think it was his, that was how he was planning to pay for it. So I think we may see some different things in the package. The package may be a little bigger than what we otherwise might have seen, but it'll be a similar process.
So, Marty, you get the last question, but before you do, would everyone please join me in thanking our panelists this morning? I try to be respectful of the 9 o'clock hour, and perhaps our panelists are willing to hang around a little bit. If you have a question, you didn't have an opportunity to ask it. But Marty, go ahead and ask the last formal question of the group.
Keep it super brief. So yeah, Marty Groman, former legislator, recovering congressional candidate. Independents feel left out of the primary process. Do you think there's any willingness to consider in this session an open primary discussion?
I hope so. I am a huge advocate of allowing unenrolled voters to participate in the primary process. We need to engage more voters in that decision-making process so that we have broader consensus candidates who can more effectively reflect the general population. I think the parties are super reluctant to do that. I know Ken Ackley went to the Maine Democratic Party and, presented his idea, and he basically was shown the door. And I thought that was disappointing. I wrote a letter of support for him in that. I know the parties don't want that, but in my personal opinion, I think it's better for the state of Maine to engage as many people in as much of the process as possible. I think the outcome is better, just like a 2/3 budget is better than a majority budget.
Who makes that decision? Is that a Secretary of State decision? How do you do that?
It's a statute.
It's a statute, so it would have to be passed by the lawmakers?
I would agree with Mike that I would love to see the change, but I don't expect it. There is a really strong feeling among active Democrats and elected officials and Republicans, I'm sure, that parties should choose their nominees and the party members should choose. The problem becomes, of course, that in a state, especially like Maine, where there are more unenrolled voters than in either party, although those numbers are starting to change a bit, but nonetheless it still holds true that we are necessarily excluding the biggest group from participating in choosing who the candidates will be, and what we've seen is a continuation towards the edges rather than in the middle. And the other way, of course, to deal with that, it would be a constitutional amendment to actually implement the ranked choice voting process that the people have said over and over again they want.
So I'm a bare-knuckle partisan, so I say no thanks, no problem. And but I do think that the issue is going to come to the forefront when a constitutional amendment to implement ranked choice voting at the state level fails. I think that will prompt a discussion about another way of getting to maybe a runoff type of format that's similar to a California model. So I think we're going to have the discussion. You're going to see the parties weigh in antagonistically about open primaries, and or having unenrolleds join the fray. But this is going to be interesting to see. I'm very involved in the ranked choice voting as counsel to the Poliquin campaign. But seeing how this plays out, I'm fascinated by it as a political science hack. So,
cool, great. Well, thank you again, everyone. Come back in January.